Wow, these excerpts from Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography are incredible. To hear his experiences and thoughts in his own words is just so powerful.
Yeah, it's really something else. It's different than reading about him, you know?
Yeah.
Like we get a more personal, intimate glimpse into his life and how he became the leader we know.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're going beyond just the famous speeches. We're going to explore those lesser known aspects of his life and really understand what shaped his views on social justice. These excerpts cover so much ground, from his childhood and education to his early ministry and the very beginnings of the civil rights movement.
It's fascinating how much his upbringing, especially his father's influence, kind of laid the groundwork for his later activism. He talks about his father as this man of incredible integrity, someone who was deeply committed to his principles.
Yeah, and not afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even when it made others uncomfortable.
Exactly. It seems like that moral strength was almost like a family inheritance in a way.
It makes you wonder how those early lessons from his father impacted how King approached confronting injustice later in life.
Right. I think it instilled in him this deep sense of right and wrong, a conviction that some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. But it's also interesting to see how he wrestled with his own internal conflicts, especially when it came to race. He talks about this experience he had when he was young. He and his father were in a shoe store, and they were forced to move to the back because they were black. King actually writes about the hatred he felt towards white people in that moment.
Wow, that's really raw and honest.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. It must have been so jarring for a young boy, especially considering, his upbringing was centered around love and Christian values.
Definitely. It's like this clash between the reality of segregation and the ideals he was raised with.
Absolutely. And he talks about grappling with that hatred, trying to reconcile it with his Christian duty to love everyone.
It highlights that really personal impact of segregation, like the psychological toll it took.
Yeah. And this internal tension between love and hate, justice and injustice, that becomes a recurring theme throughout his life.
It seems like his faith played a key role in navigating that tension. The excerpts also touch on how King's views on social justice and the role of the church evolved over time.
Right. He felt that a lot of educated ministers kind of lost people in these theological abstractions. They didn't really connect those ideas to people's everyday lives.
What did he propose instead?
He was drawn to what's known as the social gospel, the idea that faith should be actively applied to social issues. Things like poverty, unemployment, economic inequality.
So not just talking about faith, but actually putting it into action.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how someone with such a deeply rooted faith grappled with some of the more radical ideas circulating at the time, like Marxism. The excerpts mention King actually read Marx, and he found himself agreeing with some of his critiques of capitalism. What aspects of Marx's thought resonated with him? And how did he reconcile those ideas with his own beliefs?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. King saw that gap between the rich and the poor, and he recognized how that constant pursuit of profit could lead to, a culture that devalues human life. Now, he wasn't advocating for a communist revolution or anything like that, but he was willing to engage with those critiques, to find solutions to the injustice he saw.
That openness to different ideologies speaks volumes about his intellectual curiosity and his commitment to finding practical solutions to complex problems. This intellectual journey takes us to his time at Boston University, where he really delved deep into personalistic philosophy while pursuing his doctorate. This wasn't just some academic exercise for King, though. It seems like personalism deeply resonated with his worldview and influenced his approach to social justice. Can you unpack that connection for us?
So personalism, it emphasizes this centrality of the person in understanding reality. And this really resonated with King's belief in a personal God and the inherent dignity of every human being.
I see.
It gave him a framework for his belief that any system that degrades or dehumanizes individuals is inherently wrong. His commitment to social justice wasn't just about political or social reform. It stemmed from a really profound belief in the sanctity of the individual.
So it's like we're seeing all these different threads come together, his personal experiences, his spiritual upbringing, and his intellectual exploration, all shaping his core beliefs.
Yeah.
And amidst all this, serious intellectual and spiritual development, he also meets the love of his life, Coretta Scott.
Yeah. While he was in Boston, he met Coretta, who was studying to be a concert singer. King was immediately smitten. He even told his mother she was going to be his wife before they were even engaged.
Oh, that's a sweet story. But their connection went beyond just romance. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
From what I've read, Coretta wasn't just a, supportive spouse. She was a partner in this struggle from the very beginning, sharing his dedication to social justice.
Yeah, they were definitely partners. And it was during this time that they faced their first major test as a couple and as activists.
Yeah.
The Montgomery bus boycott.
This wasn't just a pivotal moment for the civil rights movement. It was a real trial by fire for King personally.
For sure.
He writes about his internal struggles with fear and uncertainty, the immense pressure he felt as the spokesperson for this growing movement.
It's a lot to carry for anyone, let alone someone so young.
What struck you about his account of this period?
What I find remarkable is how, even though he was grappling with his own doubts, he was able to tap into that incredible energy and determination of the Black community in Montgomery. He organized carpools, walked miles to work, just refused to be broken by the city. He even describes it as a tidal wave of enthusiasm.
It's incredible how even the city's attempts to undermine the boycott backfired. Like when they ordered taxi companies to charge a minimum fare.
Oh, yeah. They were hoping to make it too expensive for people to support the boycott.
But the organizers responded by setting up a system of volunteer drivers.
Talk about resourcefulness.
Yeah.
They were not going to be deterred.
It seems like this experience solidified King's belief in nonviolence as a potent force for change.
Absolutely. And his reflections on the new Negro, as he calls it, are so insightful. He's talking about this shift in the Black community, this newfound courage.
Like a refusal to accept the status quo.
Exactly. He even recounts this incident where a false newspaper article claimed that the boycott had been settled.
Oh, wow. It was a blatant attempt to demoralize the boycott.
Right. But instead of panicking, they kept going. It's like they realized the power of their collective will.
That's powerful. But this newfound boldness wasn't met without resistance. King talks about the bombing of his home.
It's 2:00.
A terrifying act of violence meant to intimidate him and the entire movement.
Absolutely. But even in the face of such a direct threat, King stayed true to his message of nonviolence, urging his supporters not to retaliate, to continue the struggle with love and peace.
His commitment to nonviolence wasn't just, a personal philosophy. It was rooted in his study of Mahatma Gandhi.
Right. His trip to India was clearly a major turning point for him.
He spent a month immersed in Gandhi's philosophy, seeing how nonviolent resistance had actually, dismantled the British Empire. It was like a pilgrimage.
And what's so striking is how King realized that love, strategically applied, could be this powerful force, even against seemingly, impossible odds. He even met with Prime Minister Nehru during his visit.
That's right.
And they discussed India's approach to the caste system. It seems like King was always looking for solutions that could be applied to the American context.
He's a constant learner, always evolving, drawing inspiration from different sources.
But this pursuit of justice took a toll. King writes about the constant travel, the speaking engagements, the organizing, the writing. It was a heavy burden.
He even decided to dedicate a day a week to silence and meditation. He knew he needed to recharge.
That must have been tough, needing to step back while the movement was demanding so much of his time and energy.
It just shows the human side of this iconic figure.
And this is just the beginning of his story. We haven't even gotten to Birmingham, his arrest, the letter from a Birmingham jail. There's so much more to uncover in King's journey.
Absolutely. His life was it was remarkable, a testament to his commitment to justice.
We'll delve deeper into all of that when we return for part 2 of our deep dive into the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. We left off with King facing, the weight of leading this movement while also dealing with the personal toll it took. As we get into this next part of his story, we're going to see both those incredible challenges and those major triumphs. And Birmingham is really where a lot of that comes to a head. It wasn't a random choice to focus on Birmingham, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, Birmingham was known as one of the most segregated cities in the entire South. King and his team, they knew that if they confronted injustice there, it would force the nation to really face the ugliness of Jim Crow.
It was a strategic move to really push the boundaries and provoke a reaction. And they definitely got one. King was arrested during the Birmingham campaign and put in solitary confinement.
Which was a tactic specifically designed to break him, to crush his spirit.
But even in that isolation, he wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is, it's one of the most powerful defenses of civil disobedience ever written.
Absolutely. And to think it was like scribble on scraps of paper, smuggled out of jail.
It's amazing. It speaks to his resilience and his commitment to the cause, even in the face of such adversity.
For sure. The letter itself it's a masterpiece of reasoning and persuasion. He takes on those who called him an outside agitator and just dismantles their arguments.
He makes such a strong case for why he was morally obligated to be in Birmingham. You know, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
It's true. It's an argument for solidarity, you know, that we can't just stand by and watch injustice happen somewhere else.
Right. It's a universal moral imperative. And his point about just and unjust laws, that's brilliant.
Absolutely. He argues that we have to obey just laws, but we also have an obligation to disobey unjust laws.
And that famous line, an unjust law is no law at all. So powerful.
Right. And he uses all these historical examples to back it up. You know, Socrates, early Christians who defied unjust laws. He even mentions Hitler, how his actions were completely legal in Nazi Germany.
It's a reminder that legality and morality, they're not always the same.
Yeah, blind obedience to authority, especially when it's, you know, upholding unjust systems, it can be so dangerous.
Absolutely. And King, he refused to just passively accept those laws, even when it came to his own release from jail. There's that story about how they tried to pay his fine to get him out, but he refused.
He felt that sense of responsibility to those who were still in prison for protesting. You wouldn't abandon them.
It's kind of ironic being forced out of jail because you're standing by your principles.
It shows his commitment to those who were, you know, most vulnerable, even when it was personally risky for him.
He really understood what true leadership meant, but amidst all this struggle, there were also those moments of, you know, real human connection. He talks about how his family supported him during this time, especially his father.
Yeah, even the most courageous people, they need support, that encouragement during those tough times. And he also mentions Coretta.
How crucial she was in keeping things going while he was, you know, imprisoned.
Exactly, their partnership. It was so vital to the movement.
And after Birmingham, the movement gained so much momentum. And we can't talk about this period without talking about the March on Washington and, of course, the I Have a Dream speech. What are your thoughts on that speech and its legacy?
Well, it's a speech that continues to resonate today across generations and cultures. It's able to express this vision of a just future while acknowledging the pain of the present.
He doesn't shy away from the realities of, you know, racism and discrimination. He confronts them, but he still offers that vision of a future where his children would be judged by their character, not the color of their skin.
That's right. That vision continues to inspire people. But, you know, the journey towards that dream, it was filled with setbacks, like the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham.
Just weeks after the March on Washington, too.
It's a stark reminder of the hatred King and the movement were up against.
4 young girls killed in a church. It's horrifying.
It was devastating. But even after this, you know, King urged his supporters to keep going, to not let hate win.
That commitment to nonviolence, even in the face of such a tragedy, it's hard to fathom. And then you have the Selma to Montgomery marches, which focused on the right to vote.
The images from those marches, especially the attack on the protesters on Bloody Sunday, it shocked the nation.
It was a turning point. Public opinion really started to shift, and it helped pave the way for the Voting Rights Act.
A huge victory. But it didn't mean the struggle was over. And King, you know, he understood this. He had some really insightful observations about the Watts riots that happened in Los Angeles that same year.
He didn't condone the violence, but he understood the frustration that fueled it.
He saw the systemic inequalities that had been ignored for so long.
It was like a warning that achieving legal equality, it wasn't enough.
Right. The movement needed to address the root causes of poverty if they wanted real change.
And this led to a shift in focus for King. Right. He started to direct his attention to poverty and inequality in the North. He even moved to Chicago to experience the realities of the slums.
Yeah, he was really appalled by the conditions he saw, the exploitation, the lack of access to jobs and transportation. He called it the ghettoization of Black communities.
And argued that the movement had to expand to address economic injustice as well as racial injustice.
Which led to the Chicago Freedom Movement and the fight for open housing.
It was about ensuring fair access to housing, but they faced so much resistance.
Yeah, violence, intimidation. It showed that racism wasn't just a Southern problem.
The fight for equality had to be fought on multiple fronts. And it was during this time that the Black Power movement emerged, which presented some challenges for King.
It was a more militant approach to racial justice.
And it questioned the effectiveness of nonviolence.
King, at first, he had reservations about the slogan, Black Power. He worried about it being misinterpreted as a call for violence.
But he also recognized the frustration behind it.
Right, that feeling that nonviolence hadn't worked fast enough.
How did he navigate that tension between, his commitment to nonviolence and those calls for a more confrontational approach?
He tried to find common ground between those who wanted integration and those who wanted Black empowerment.
It was a difficult position to be in.
He faced criticism from both sides, but he stayed true to his values: love, nonviolence, social justice.
He kept speaking out against the Vietnam War, which he saw as taking resources away from addressing poverty here at home.
And he launched the Poor People's Campaign, which was a multiracial effort to address poverty across the country.
He wanted to connect the struggles of Black Americans to the struggles of all marginalized people.
It was a massive undertaking.
And then, tragically, his assassination in 1968, a devastating loss.
It was. But even in his final days, his words were so inspiring.
His last speech, "I've been to the mountaintop," the day before his death, it's so powerful. What struck you about that speech, knowing, it would be his last?
There's a sense of urgency there, but also this profound sense of peace.
Yeah.
Like he had accepted his fate.
And it connects back to his focus on caring for the most vulnerable. He ties the Memphis sanitation workers' strike to his message about helping those in need.
Right. It wasn't just about ideas for King. It was about action.
Even in his final hours, he was living out his beliefs. It's a fitting end to this journey we've been on, through his life, marked by struggle, by sacrifice, and by an unwavering commitment to justice.
It really is.
We've covered so much, but we've only scratched the surface. What resonates most with you from his story?
I think his ability to maintain hope, even when facing so much hate and violence, it's inspiring.
We'll continue exploring King's life and legacy in the final part of our deep dive. What are your reflections as we move toward that final chapter? It's amazing how, even as King faced all these challenges, he never gave up on fighting for justice and equality.
Yeah, he seemed to know that time was running out. There was still so much to do.
And that brings us to his last speech, "I've been to the mountaintop."
Yeah.
The one he gave the night before he was assassinated. It's such a powerful speech. And you mentioned earlier how it connects to his belief in caring for the most vulnerable. How does that theme come through in this final speech, especially with the sanitation workers' strike happening in Memphis?
Well, it's not just some abstract concept for King, He's there in Memphis standing with these workers who are fighting for basic dignity, for fair treatment. He sees their struggle as part of a much larger fight for economic justice, for human rights.
He even brings up the parable of the Good Samaritan, emphasizing that we have to take action to help those who are in need. It doesn't matter what their social status is.
Exactly. True compassion, it means more than just feeling sorry for someone. It means actually doing something. And he ties that directly to the sanitation workers' demands for, better wages and working conditions.
He's saying that everyone deserves respect, no matter what their job is. And there's this sense of urgency in his voice, like when he urges the workers to stick it out, to not give up. It's like he knew that time was running out. Maybe not just for him, but for the movement as a whole.
There's a real sense of defiance in his words when he says, "I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land."
Yeah, it's like he's acknowledging his own mortality,
Yeah.
but he's still so certain that justice will prevail in the end.
And even though he's talking to these sanitation workers in Memphis, his message is for everyone. He's challenging all of us to stand up against injustice wherever we see it, to fight for those who are being oppressed.
It's a call to action that still feels so relevant today.
It does. He understood that the fight for civil rights was part of a much bigger movement, a global movement for human rights and social justice.
His words are still so inspiring to people all over the world.
Yeah, he really was a visionary.
It's incredible how much we learn about King from these excerpts, from his autobiography. We see him as a scholar, a theologian, a strategist, a leader, but most importantly, he was a deeply compassionate human being who dedicated his life to creating a better world.
What I find so remarkable is that he never gave up on nonviolence. Even when he was facing so much hatred and violence himself, he truly believed that love could be this powerful force for change.
And even though he accomplished so much in his lifetime, he knew the fight for equality wasn't over, and it still isn't. His life shows us that we all have a role to play in creating a more just world.
He challenged us to, look at our own biases, to speak up when we see injustice, and to never lose hope.
That's a powerful message. Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., but there's so much more to explore. I encourage everyone to read his full autobiography, to really dive into his speeches and his writings, and think about how we can apply his teachings to our own lives. The fight for justice continues, and we can all be a part of it. Thanks for joining us.